For years, the relationship between the United States and Canada has been treated as automatic, stable, predictable, almost boring. Two neighbors sharing the longest undefended border in the world, deeply integrated economies, and a political rhythm that seemed immune to sudden shocks. But what most people miss is that stability like this doesn't disappear with explosions or speeches. It erodes quietly. It weakens through small decisions that look harmless in isolation but devastating when combined. And that's exactly where we are now, because what just happened between the United States and Canada wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. There were no dramatic press conferences, no flags burning, no emergency summits broadcast live. Instead, it unfolded the way real power shifts always do, slowly, procedurally, almost invisibly, until one day, the consequences become impossible to ignore. The United States believed it was playing a familiar game. Pressure a partner, signal strength, extract concessions. The assumption was simple. Canada has nowhere else to go. Geography would do the enforcing. History would do the persuading. Dependency would do the rest. But that assumption was outdated the moment it was made. Because the world Canada operates in today is not the world Washington still imagines. Canada no longer sees itself as a junior partner reacting to American moods. It sees itself as a strategic node in a changing global system. And when you understand that shift, everything that followed starts to make sense. What's happening now isn't about a single tariff, a single trade dispute, or a single political figure. It's about how alliances behave when trust turns into leverage and leverage turns into resentment. And once that line is crossed, the damage isn't temporary. It compounds. The United States assumed that pressure would create obedience, but pressure only works when the target believes there are no alternatives. Canada, quietly and methodically, has been building alternatives for years. Energy was the first signal, not loudly announced, not framed as retaliation, but repositioned. Canadian energy exports began flowing with more strategic flexibility, not cutting off the U.S., not provoking headlines, but diversifying. The message wasn't, we're leaving, it was, we're no longer dependent. Then came supply chains. The U.S. political class still talks about supply chains as if they're static pipes you can turn on and off. In reality, they're living systems. They adapt, they reroute, they remember how they were treated. Canadian firms began restructuring relationships, signing longer-term agreements elsewhere, reducing exposure where risk had increased. None of this was emotional, it was rational. And then came the moment Washington didn't expect, the moment when the assumption of indispensability collapsed. Because when a system believes it is essential, it stops asking whether it is trusted. Canada didn't announce defiance. It demonstrated it through contracts, through regulatory alignment, through quiet coordination with partners who were more predictable, more consistent, less transactional, the kind of partners who don't change the rules every election cycle. What made this especially damaging for the United States wasn't that Canada moved. It was that others noticed. Allies always watch how a country treats its closest partners. If pressure replaces cooperation at the core, no peripheral alliance feels safe. This is where the miscalculation becomes structural. The U.S. strategy assumed that Canada's cost of resistance would always be higher than America's cost of pressure. That math used to be true. It isn't anymore. Because the cost of pressure today isn't paid immediately. It's paid over time. In lost coordination, in duplicated systems, in parallel alliances that no longer include you by default. And Canada understands something Washington often forgets. Power today isn't about dominance, it's about reliability. You don't need to win every negotiation if others believe you'll be there tomorrow behaving the same way. The moment that belief weakens, even superior power starts to decay. The response wasn't emotional nationalism, it was institutional realism. Canadian policymakers didn't ask how to punish the United States. They asked how to protect themselves from unpredictability. And when that becomes the guiding question, the answer is always diversification, trade diversification, energy diversification, diplomatic diversification, even narrative diversification. The United States still talks as if North America is a closed system. It isn't. It's a platform connected to global flows. And platforms don't tolerate instability well. They route around it. What's most striking is how little noise accompanied this shift. No grandstanding, no victory speeches, just steady movement. The kind that only becomes visible when it's already advanced too far to reverse easily. This is the part most commentators miss. They look for retaliation where none exists. They look for punishment when the real action is insulation. Canada isn't trying to hurt the U.S., it's trying to make U.S. pressure irrelevant, and that's far more dangerous. Because once a partner stops reacting to your pressure, your leverage disappears, you can raise tariffs, you can issue threats, you can escalate rhetoric. But if the system no longer depends on your cooperation, those tools lose force. This isn't theoretical. We're already seeing the consequences. American producers facing higher costs. Consumers absorbing price shifts they were told wouldn't happen. Industries discovering that what was once guaranteed access is now conditional. And none of this required Canada to win in a dramatic sense. It required patience, institutional memory, and a willingness to accept short-term friction to avoid long-term vulnerability. The irony is that this didn't need to happen. Stable alliances don't fracture because of disagreement. They fracture because disagreement turns into coercion, and coercion, once normalized, never stays contained. Canada learned a lesson many countries have learned before. If your closest ally begins treating you like a variable instead of a constant, you must stop being predictable. From Washington's perspective, this still looks manageable. There's a belief that things can be reset, that a phone call, a new administration, or a policy adjustment will restore the old equilibrium. But equilibrium doesn't reset on command. It's rebuilt through consistent behavior over time, and that time is already being used by others. Europe noticed, Asia noticed, emerging economies noticed. When Canada adjusted its posture, it sent a signal far beyond North America. It signaled that even the most integrated partnerships are being reconsidered, not abandoned, rebalanced. This is how power shifts in the modern era, not through conquest but through choice, not through rebellion but through redesign. The US didn't lose Canada overnight. It began losing the assumption that Canada had no alternatives. And once that assumption dies, every negotiation becomes harder because leverage isn't something you declare, it's something others grant you. And right now, Canada is quietly deciding how much of that leverage the United States deserves. What happens next won't be decided by speeches or elections alone. It will be decided by whether Washington understands the difference between pressure and persuasion, between dominance and trust, between being powerful and being indispensable. If it doesn't, the most damaging consequences won't show up in headlines. They'll show up in contracts that aren't signed, in meetings that don't include American representatives, in systems that continue functioning perfectly well without U.S. input. That's the real shift, not Canada defying Washington, but Canada designing a future where defiance isn't necessary. And once a country reaches that point, there's no quick way back. And the deeper problem is that once a country begins planning for irrelevance, it also begins redefining loyalty. Loyalty stops being emotional and becomes conditional. Cooperation turns transactional. And transactional relationships, by definition, can be replaced. This is the phase the United States is only beginning to notice. Because from Washington's vantage point, Canada still looks close. Trade still flows. Diplomats still smile. Joint statements still get released. But proximity is not the same thing as alignment. And alignment is what actually generates power. The illusion of closeness is dangerous. It convinces policymakers that nothing fundamental has changed, when in reality the foundations are already shifting beneath their feet. What makes this particularly consequential is timing. This shift is happening during a broader global recalibration. Supply chains are fragmenting, energy routes are being redrawn, security assumptions are being questioned. In moments like this, countries that move early gain leverage. Countries that react late pay premiums. Canada moved early. The United States assumed it could always course-correct later, that allies would wait, that patience was infinite. But patience is a function of trust, and trust, once strained, becomes scarce. From a strategic perspective, this isn't about blame. It's about incentives. When incentives change, behavior follows. Canada's incentives have changed. Dependence is no longer rewarded. Flexibility is. And flexibility doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. Every alternative supplier added, every new agreement signed, every coordination forum joined without U.S. leadership present. Each move individually looks minor. Together, they form a pattern. Patterns are what strategists watch for, not statements. This is where Washington's internal debate becomes critical. There are still voices that believe pressure can restore compliance, that harder tactics will force recalibration. But this misunderstands the nature of modern alliances. Pressure works best against adversaries. Against allies, it corrodes. It creates the very independence it seeks to prevent. Canada isn't rejecting cooperation. It's redefining it. Cooperation now comes with conditions, with safeguards, with exit options. That alone should alarm policymakers, because alliances that include exit options are no longer alliances of necessity. They are alliances of convenience, and convenience has a shelf life. And the deeper problem is that once a country begins planning for irrelevance, it also begins redefining loyalty. Loyalty stops being emotional and becomes conditional. Cooperation turns transactional. And transactional relationships, by definition, can be replaced. This is the phase the United States is only beginning to notice, because from Washington's vantage point, Canada still looks close. Trade still flows. Diplomats still smile. Joint statements still get released. But proximity is not the same thing as alignment. And alignment is what actually generates power. The illusion of closeness is dangerous. It convinces policymakers that nothing fundamental has changed, when in reality the foundations are already shifting beneath their feet. Canada's approach now is not reactive. It's anticipatory. Instead of asking what the United States will do next, Canadian planners are asking what the global system will look like 5, 10, 15 years from now, and how exposed they want to be to any single actor's volatility. That question alone changes everything. Because when a country starts planning for volatility, it stops betting on permanence. And the United States, for most of the post-war era, benefited enormously from the assumption that it was permanent. Permanent leadership, permanent access, permanent centrality. That assumption is eroding, not because American power has vanished, but because American predictability has. Power without predictability forces allies to hedge, and hedging is the beginning of strategic independence. This is why the most important developments aren't happening in public view. They're happening inside regulatory agencies, trade offices, and strategic planning units. Quiet places, technical places, places that don't generate headlines but shape outcomes. Canada is aligning standards, harmonizing regulations with partners beyond the United States, structuring agreements that don't rely on political goodwill. These aren't symbolic gestures, they are structural choices. And structural choices are hard to reverse. The most damaging consequence may not be economic at all. It may be psychological. Once Canada internalizes the idea that it must protect itself from American unpredictability, that lens colors every future interaction. Every negotiation becomes more cautious, every commitment more hedged. Trust doesn't vanish overnight. It thins, and thin trust cannot sustain deep integration. This has implications far beyond Canada. Other U.S. partners are watching closely, not to imitate Canada's actions exactly, but to study the logic behind them. If diversification is rational for Canada, why wouldn't it be rational elsewhere? This is how systemic shifts spread, not through imitation, but through validation. The United States still has enormous advantages: scale, innovation, military reach. But advantages only matter if others choose to plug into them. Choice is the operative word. Power that depends on choice must be cultivated, not coerced, and that is where the current strategy falters. The belief that economic pressure can substitute for strategic patience is tempting. It promises faster results, clear victories, simple narratives. But in complex systems, speed often produces fragility. Canada has chosen resilience over speed. That choice doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't satisfy audiences hungry for conflict, but it reshapes outcomes quietly and permanently. If Washington wants to restore what's been lost, it won't do so by escalating. It will do so by reestablishing predictability, by signaling restraint, by demonstrating that cooperation isn't conditional on compliance. Whether that lesson is learned remains an open question. Because systems once rerouted don't snap back easily. They continue flowing along the paths that proved most reliable. And Canada is already walking those paths. What makes this moment especially revealing is how little attention it received while it was unfolding. There was no single decision you could point to and say, this is where everything changed. Instead, there was a gradual accumulation of small adjustments, each justified on its own terms, each defensible, each easy to overlook. That is how modern power realignments happen. They don't arrive as shocks, they arrive as habits. Canada's institutions have begun behaving differently because they now assume a different future. When you assume stability, you optimize for efficiency. When you assume volatility, you optimize for control. That shift in assumption quietly alters everything from procurement strategies to diplomatic tone. For decades, Canadian policymakers assumed that alignment with the United States was the safest long-term position. That assumption was rooted in consistency. The rules didn't change abruptly. Commitments, once made, were honored across administrations. Disagreements existed, but they were contained within predictable boundaries. When those boundaries became less clear, planning logic changed. This isn't a judgment about intentions. It's a recognition of patterns. States don't respond to rhetoric, they respond to incentives and risk. And when risk increases, diversification follows. One of the most underestimated consequences of this shift is institutional memory. Bureaucracies remember friction long after politicians move on. They encode caution into procedures. They build safeguards into agreements. And once those safeguards exist, Removing them becomes politically costly. Canada's response has already been institutionalized. That means even a future attempt at rapprochement will encounter resistance, not emotional resistance, but procedural resistance. Layers of review, risk assessments, contingency clauses, all perfectly rational, all slowing reintegration. From Washington's perspective, this can feel frustrating. It can appear as unnecessary hesitation, even ingratitude. But from Canada's perspective, it is simply prudence. And prudence, once normalized, rarely retreats. The strategic irony is that this transformation doesn't weaken Canada's relationship with the United States immediately. It weakens it gradually by reducing its centrality. The U.S. becomes one partner among several rather than the default reference point. When that happens, influence doesn't disappear. It becomes negotiable. Negotiable influence is fundamentally different from assumed influence. It must be earned repeatedly, maintained continuously, and shared with others. This is the environment Canada is now navigating. It's not an act of rebellion, it's an act of recalibration. What's striking is how well this approach aligns with broader global trends. Mid-sized powers across the world are pursuing similar strategies. They are avoiding binary alignments. They are constructing flexible networks. They are reducing exposure to single points of failure. Canada is simply executing this logic within North America. That should concern Washington not because it represents hostility, but because it represents normalization. If even the most stable partnership begins operating on hedging logic, the era of automatic alignment is over. This has consequences for negotiation leverage, for crisis coordination, for long-term strategic planning. Systems that once moved in tandem now require coordination mechanisms that didn't exist before. Coordination takes time. Time introduces friction. Friction creates opportunity for others. This is how influence dissipates, not through confrontation, but through complexity. The United States still has the ability to reverse course, but reversal is not a declaration. It is a demonstration over time. It requires consistency that spans administrations, predictability that survives domestic political cycles, and restraint that reassures partners they are not bargaining chips. Whether such a shift is politically feasible remains uncertain. Domestic incentives often reward toughness over reliability, short-term signaling over long-term trust. But international systems are indifferent to domestic narratives. They respond only to behavior. Canada is responding to behavior. And once responses are encoded into strategy, they become difficult to unwind. The long-term risk for the United States isn't isolation, it's dilution. A world in which American input still matters, but no longer defines outcomes. Where decisions are shaped collaboratively but without U.S. leadership being assumed. That kind of world doesn't emerge suddenly. It emerges when enough partners quietly prepare for it. Canada is doing exactly that, not loudly, not defiantly, but deliberately. And in strategic affairs, deliberation is often more decisive than force.